Welcome to Latino Stories. If you love jaw-dropping HOA drama, you're in the right place. From corrupt board members to outrageous neighborhood disputes, we expose the wildest HOA scandals. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Now, let's dive into today's crazy HOA tale.
Psycho HOA Karen thought she could discriminate against disabled people and get away with it. So when she thought no one was watching, she lost her mind and pushed my disabled son into a river. All because she decided he was ruining the neighborhood. She was obsessed with controlling everything, dictating who belonged and who didn't. But what she didn't know was that I'm a retired drill sergeant, and I don't take kindly to bullies. What started as a petty neighborhood dispute quickly spiraled into something far more dangerous. Here's what happened. Throughout my life, I've encountered all kinds of people. Tough, disciplined soldiers trained for battle, nervous recruits hardened through relentless training, and everyday civilians carrying struggles just as heavy as any battlefield. From the heat of active war zones to the controlled chaos of boot camps, conflict was never far from me. I've broken up bar fights between hot-headed soldiers, talked panicked rookies through their first real challenges, and stood my ground in arguments where losing my cool could mean losing respect. I have stared into the eyes of enemies, barked orders at recruits who feared failure more than pain, and stood my ground in situations where hesitation meant disaster. But nothing prepared me for the venomous hatred I would encounter in the comfort of what was supposed to be a peaceful, well-manicured neighborhood. I expected to leave behind the tension of my old life when I moved here. I thought I was stepping into a quiet, friendly community, where people looked out for each other, where neighbors greeted one another with a smile, and where my son could finally feel safe. Instead, I found something far uglier. A different kind of enemy. One who didn't need a uniform or a weapon to inflict damage. One who hid their cruelty behind HOA rules, passive-aggressive smiles, and a twisted sense of control. I will call her Karen even though that's not her real name. And she had no idea who she was messing with. After spending years in active duty, I reached a point where it was time for a new chapter. One where I wasn't just a soldier but a mentor. I traded combat zones for training grounds, shifting my focus to shaping the next generation of soldiers. As a drill sergeant, I took raw civilian recruits and forged them into combat-ready warriors. I turned wide-eyed volunteers into disciplined fighters, pushing them past their limits, preparing them for the unforgiving realities of military life. Being a drill sergeant is one of the toughest, most grueling jobs in the Army, but it's also one of the most rewarding. Long hours, constant pressure, and no room for failure, but I had walked this path before. I knew what it took to survive, and I was determined to pass that knowledge on. Some recruits came in cocky, thinking they were invincible. Others arrived scared out of their minds, unsure if they belonged. I saw it as my duty to break them down and build them back up, stronger, sharper, and ready for anything. And in between the grueling training sessions, the mud-soaked drills, and the brutal conditioning, I found myself retelling my own boot camp horror stories. The sleepless nights, the relentless drills, the moments where I thought I'd collapse from sheer exhaustion, only to be pushed even further. After 27 years of service, I had trained some of the best soldiers the Army had to offer. But over time, something started to change. The job that once defined me began to take its toll. The long hours, the constant stress, the emotional weight of sending young recruits off to war. It all started to wear me down. Then came the final straw, a tragic training accident. One of my most promising recruits, a kid barely out of high school, suffered a fatal injury during an advanced combat drill. I had drilled safety protocols into their heads 1,000 times, but sometimes fate is cruel. I carried that loss like a weight on my chest. It wasn't my fault, but it felt like it was. After that, I started seeing things differently. The Army had been my life since I was 17, but at 44, I finally realized I was missing something far more important: time with my 11-year-old son. I had spent years shaping the futures of countless soldiers, but I barely had time to shape my own child's. That's when I knew it was time to go. So I did. Leaving the Army was a big change. Instead of waking up to the sound of morning drills and barking orders at recruits, I woke up to something different. more time with my family. And for the first time in years, I could focus on being more than just a soldier. I could be a father first. I wanted a fresh start. For me, but more importantly, for my son. My 11-year-old son, Nathan, had faced his own battles since the day he was born. He had a neurological condition that affected his mobility, and though he never let it define him, I saw the frustration in his eyes every time his body refused to cooperate with his determination. For years, we had managed in our old home, adapting as best we could. But as he got older, the reality became clear. Our house was working against him, not for him. The narrow hallways, the steep front steps, the door frames too tight for easy movement. Every day felt like an obstacle course, and I knew it was only going to get worse. That's when I made the decision to move, to give my son a fresh start, somewhere he wouldn't feel trapped by the walls around him. A home where he could move freely without frustration. A peaceful neighborhood, far from the chaos of my past life, where he could just be a kid without limits, safe, supported, and surrounded by the unwavering love of his father. At least that's what I thought. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. We packed up our lives and left the bustling city behind when I found this quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of town that seemed like everything we had hoped for. The houses were well kept, the lawns manicured, and the streets quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of place where people took pride in their homes, where kids rode their bikes without a care in the world, and where the biggest neighborhood concerns were things like holiday decorations or whose lawn needed mowing. Felt like the right move. And to my surprise, the neighborhood seemed warm and welcoming. As soon as our moving truck pulled up, a few curious neighbors made their way over, eager to introduce themselves. Some offered a few words of wisdom about local stores and the best places to grab a bite to eat, while others went a step further, grabbing boxes right out of my hands and helping me carry them inside without a second thought. It was a stark contrast from the world I had come from, where trust was earned through sweat and sacrifice. Here, people seemed genuinely friendly, and for a brief moment, I thought we had landed in exactly the kind of place I had been hoping for. A place where my son and I could finally breathe easy. And then I met her. She lived right across the street, standing on her porch with arms crossed like a general surveying new recruits. I noticed her watching us from the moment we arrived, her sharp eyes tracking every movement. When she finally walked over, her smile was forced, polite, but something about it didn't sit right. "Wow," she said, looking at the moving truck, then back at me, her tone drenched in something I couldn't quite place. I was wondering when they'd finally sell this house. It sat on the market forever. She let the words hang in the air like a thinly veiled insult. The way she said it made it clear. She wasn't thrilled about who had moved in. She introduced herself as Karen, and while her tone was friendly enough, there was something off about the way she spoke, like she was sizing me up. Still, I wasn't one to judge too quickly. I had met plenty of people who put up walls at first, only to turn out decent once you got past the exterior. So I nodded, thanked her for the welcome, and turned back to unloading. But even as I worked, I could feel it, her eyes still watching us. At the time, I brushed it off. Some people were just nosy, right? I figured she was the type who liked to be in everyone's business, always wanting to know what was going on in her neighborhood. I didn't know it then, but that wasn't just curiosity. There were people who believed they had the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. And this particularly miserable, self-righteous woman was about to turn our dream of a fresh start into a nightmare. After spending the previous day unpacking, I figured it was time for Nathan and me to step outside and start getting to know the neighborhood. Rather than knocking on doors like old-fashioned newcomers, I decided to take a more casual approach. We'd head to the neighborhood park. If this place was anything like I hoped, there would be families out enjoying the sun, kids playing, and parents chatting. A relaxed, natural way to meet people. Nathan was thrilled at the idea. He had been cooped up in the house too long, and I knew he was itching to explore. As we made our way to the park, he excitedly pointed out the things he liked. A giant oak tree perfect for shade, a small pond with ducks, and a newly built playground. And sure enough, the park was alive with families. Parents sat on benches watching their kids play, Dog walkers strolled along the paved paths, and a small group of neighbors stood in a loose circle, chatting. Felt like the perfect opportunity. As Nathan made his way toward the swings, I walked up to a group of parents standing near the basketball court. I introduced myself, explaining we had just moved into the neighborhood, and almost immediately, the atmosphere warmed. "Welcome. You must be the new family on Oak Ridge Drive," a woman with a toddler on her hip said. "We saw the moving trucks the other day. How's the unpacking going?" Another man, probably around my age, grinned. "Hope you like HOA meetings," he joked. "They can be intense." I chuckled, shaking hands with a few of them, swapping small talk about the area, local schools, and the best spots to eat nearby. Felt good, like I had made the right decision moving here. And then Karen arrived. She wasn't alone. She walked in with an air of authority, flanked by two other women who seemed to hang onto her every word. She was dressed impeccably, not a hair out of place, as if she had just stepped out of one of those real estate brochures. At first, she hadn't noticed us, too focused on meticulously ensuring the already perfect neighborhood park was perfect. But the moment she looked up and saw Nathan, her entire body tensed. It was subtle but unmistakable. Her polite, neighborly expression hardened for just a second before she caught herself, forcing a tight-lipped smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She approached the gathering but barely acknowledged Nathan, instead making some flimsy excuse about needing to head home. No more cheerful small talk, no more nosy questions about our move, just a sudden, uncomfortable change in energy. I watched her as she turned on her heel, and just as quickly as she had acknowledged us, she turned away, grabbing her friends and pretending like we weren't even there. At the time, I tried to brush it off. Maybe she had other things to do. But deep down, something told me otherwise, because I had seen that reaction before. The sudden shift, the stiff body language, the silent dismissal. It wasn't the first time someone had made a quiet decision that my son wasn't worth their time. And the fact that Nathan was the reason for that shift in her behavior, it didn't sit right with me at all. But at that moment, I let it go. After all, I had no proof that it was anything more than a coincidence. I would soon realize it was anything but. The next morning, I was up early, determined to knock out a few more tasks around the house. Unpacking was one thing, but actually settling in was another. I had a long list of things to get done, but before anything else, I needed to make a quick run to the store. As I stepped outside, I noticed that the moving truck was still parked in front of our house. The moving company was scheduled to pick it up later that afternoon, but for now, it sat at the curb, a massive metal reminder of the chaos of moving day. I didn't think much of it until I heard the unmistakable click-clack of fast-approaching footsteps. Karen. She was power walking across the street, her arms swinging in a way that told me she meant business. Her perfectly manicured nails were gripping a steaming cup of coffee, as if it were the only thing keeping her from throwing a full-blown tantrum. Her expression was pinched and irritated, like she had just swallowed something sour. "Excuse me," she called, her voice sharp, cutting through the morning air like a blade. She didn't even try to mask her annoyance. I exhaled, already bracing myself. "Morning, Karen. Something I can do for you." She pointed dramatically toward the moving truck, as if she had just uncovered a crime scene. "Yes, actually, that thing is blocking my view." I blinked. "Your view?" She let out a frustrated sigh. "Yes, I like to sit on my porch every morning and enjoy the scenery. I can't do that with a giant truck parked right in front of my house. It's ruining the aesthetic of the street." I glanced at the truck, then back at her. "It's not in front of your house, Karen. It's parked in front of mine." Karen folded her arms, clearly not amused by my logic. "It's an eyesore. This is a well-maintained community. We have standards here." I raised an eyebrow. "It's a moving truck. People move in, people move out. You act like it's a junkyard." She scoffed. "That's not the point. It's disrupting the neighborhood's charm. I don't know how things worked where you came from, but here we have a way of doing things." There it was, that thinly veiled insult. I held back the urge to roll my eyes. "It'll be gone by the afternoon." "That's not good enough," she snapped. "I have guests coming over for brunch, and I don't want them to see that when they arrive." I let out a slow breath, doing my best to stay patient. "Karen, with all due respect, your guests can handle looking at a truck for a few hours." She gasped, offended as if I had just insulted her entire bloodline. "You don't understand," she huffed. "I've lived in this neighborhood for over a decade. I know how things are supposed to look. You, on the other hand, just got here." I gave her a polite but firm smile. "Like I said, the truck will be gone later today. Until then, I think your brunch guests will survive." She pursed her lips, clearly fuming. But for once, she didn't have a comeback. Instead, she let out an exaggerated sigh, spun on her heel, and stormed back to her house, her coffee sloshing dangerously close to the rim of her cup. I exhaled slowly, watching her retreat. I had encountered plenty of entitled people in my life, but Karen? She was in a league of her own. It hadn't even been 48 hours since I moved in, and Karen was already stressing me so much. And I had a feeling this was just the beginning. After my quick trip to the store, I was ready to make some necessary changes to the house. The first task on my list? Replacing the front steps with a sloped ramp. The house had a beautiful porch, but the stairs leading up to it made Nathan's access difficult. I wasn't going to let my own son feel like a guest in his own home. I had spent years in the army using my hands, and I wasn't about to hire someone for something I could do myself. With a sledgehammer, cement, and sheer determination, I got to work. The rhythmic pounding of the hammer against the concrete echoed through the still morning air, each strike a step closer to making this house truly ours. After a solid hour of work, I decided to take a quick break. Sweat trickled down my back as I wiped my forehead and leaned against the porch railing, surveying my progress. It was already looking good, sturdy, smooth, and practical. Nathan would be able to come and go without struggling with stairs, and that was all that mattered. But then, I saw Karen again. It had just been 3 hours since her first drama with me this morning, and here she was again, marching across the street. This time, she wasn't holding a coffee cup. Both hands were free for maximum hand-on-hip action. "Excuse me," she called, her voice sharp and dripping with irritation. I exhaled and turned to face her. "Morning, Karen. Something wrong?" She scoffed, adjusting the oversized sunglasses perched on her nose. "Yes, actually. I was woken up by all this ruckus you're making. Some of us enjoy a peaceful morning." I glanced at my watch. 11:40 a.m. Hardly the crack of dawn. "Didn't realize almost 12 noon was considered early," I said, keeping my voice calm. "But I apologize if I disturbed you. I'm just making some accessibility improvements for my son." Karen barely blinked at the mention of Nathan. Instead, her gaze flickered toward the half-finished ramp, and her expression twisted with disapproval. She let out a dramatic sigh. "You know, this isn't exactly in line with the aesthetic of the neighborhood. I mean, a ramp? That's just going to look unsightly. Not to mention, it'll definitely lower property values." I let out a short chuckle, shaking my head as I wiped the sweat from my brow. This woman was unbelievable. I stared at her, momentarily stunned. Did she seriously just say that? Lower property values? I repeated, forcing a chuckle. "Karen, it's a simple, functional ramp. Not a neon sign that says, 'Welcome to an eyesore.'" But she wasn't done. Karen never was. "Look, I'm just saying." At this point, I cut her short. "Karen," I said, my voice steady but firm, "I don't recall asking for your input on my home improvements. But just to clarify, my son's ability to enter his own house safely is more important than keeping up with whatever delusional beauty standards you think this street has." For a split second, I saw something flicker in her expression. Shock, maybe even anger. But Karen, being Karen, didn't back down. With a voice dripping in condescension, she scoffed. "You know, if your situation requires all these modifications, maybe you should have chosen a home more suitable for your son." I froze. For a second, I thought maybe I had misheard her. But then she tilted her head, arms crossed, eyes narrowing like she had just made a perfectly reasonable statement. Like I was supposed to agree with her. A slow, Boiling anger settled in my chest. I took a step forward, meeting her gaze with the full force of every ounce of authority I had carried as a drill sergeant. "You listen to me, Karen," I said, my voice low but firm. "My son has every right to live in this neighborhood, just like anyone else. And if you think for a second that I give a damn about your approval, let me stop you right there." Her eyes flickered, but she didn't back down. Instead, she let out a fake, breathy laugh, shaking her head as if I was the one being unreasonable. "Oh, don't be so sensitive," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "It's just that this community has a certain standard. You have to admit, all these changes you're making aren't exactly in line with." I stepped even closer, cutting her off again. "With what?" I asked, my voice calm but unyielding. "Your warped idea of perfection?" She swallowed, but she wasn't done. "All I'm saying is, maybe this neighborhood isn't the right fit for you. It's not personal." Not personal? My fists clenched at my sides, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of an outburst. Instead, I let my silence speak for itself. I had spent decades training soldiers, dealing with men who had seen the worst of war, pushing through impossible odds. And yet, somehow, this entitled woman standing in front of me thought she could intimidate me. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. "You know what, Karen?" I said finally. "You have yourself a great day." And with that, I turned my back on her and went right back to work on my ramp. Because nothing she said would ever make me second-guess making this house perfect for my son. From behind me, I heard a sharp huff and the sound of her footsteps retreating. I didn't even bother looking up. I already knew. This wasn't the last time Karen would try to push us out. The next morning, I was flipping through the pile of mail on the kitchen counter. Mostly bills, a few junk advertisements, and a couple of welcome letters from the community, when I heard a soft knock on the door. Opening it, I was greeted by a friendly-looking woman, maybe in her mid-50s, with a warm smile and a neatly pressed cardigan. She held out a colorful flyer. "Hi there, you're Nathan's dad, right? I'm Linda from a few houses down. We met briefly the other day," she said cheerfully. I nodded, shaking her hand. "Nice to see you again, Linda. What's this?" "It's an invitation to our Riverside Summer Festival," she explained, handing me the flyer. "It's kind of a big tradition here. Food vendors, live music, and activities for all ages. Practically everyone in the neighborhood shows up. You and Nathan should come." I scanned the paper. The event was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at the local river park. There'd be games, entertainment, and a variety of stalls lining the area. And, from the looks of it, this was one of the biggest community gatherings of the year. I hesitated. After everything that had already happened with Karen, I wasn't sure if putting myself in the middle of another neighborhood event was a great idea. Linda must have noticed my pause because she gave me an understanding look. "I know moving into a new place can feel overwhelming, and I won't lie, we have some strong personalities around here," she said with a knowing chuckle. "But trust me, most of us are good people. And Nathan? I saw him at the park the other day. He seems like such a great kid. He'd love it." I exhaled, nodding. "Thanks, Linda. I'll think about it." After she left, I sat at the kitchen table, tapping the flyer against the wood, debating. I hadn't told Nathan about Karen's ridiculous complaints or the growing tension between us. There was no need to put that kind of stress on him. But even at 11, he was smart enough to pick up on things. He had noticed the awkward glances, the hushed conversations Karen shared with others at the park. He had felt it, too. When I showed him the flyer, his expression was uncertain. "Do we have to go?" "No," I admitted. "But I don't want some cranky neighbor ruining our first real chance to connect with people here. Besides, Linda seemed nice." Nathan bit his lip, clearly weighing the idea. He had always been cautious about new places and unfamiliar social situations. Given how Karen had already made us feel like outsiders, I understood his hesitation. "How about this?" I suggested. "We go for a little bit, see how it is. If it's weird, or if we feel uncomfortable, we leave. No pressure." He still didn't look entirely convinced, but after a moment, he nodded. "Okay, but just for an hour." I smiled, ruffling his hair. Deal. Neither of us knew it yet, but that picnic would change everything. By the time Saturday arrived, the sky was a brilliant shade of blue, and the warm breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. It was the kind of perfect weather that made it hard to find an excuse to stay inside. Any lingering doubts I had about attending the Riverside Summer Festival were quickly fading. Nathan and I hadn't had much time to relax since moving here. Between unpacking, adjusting, and dealing with Karen's nonsense, we hadn't really been able to just enjoy ourselves. This event, despite my reservations, seemed like a chance to do just that. So we went. As we pulled up to the festival grounds, I was relieved to see that a decent crowd had already gathered. Families setting up blankets, kids darting between booths, neighbors chatting in small circles. It had the easygoing energy of a well-loved community tradition, and for the first time in a while I felt like maybe, just maybe, this was exactly what we needed. First, everything seemed promising. Nathan's face lit up when he saw a group of kids playing near a game booth, and I could already tell he was itching to join in. The atmosphere was warm, inviting, and for the first few minutes, I actually allowed myself to believe we had lucked out. That maybe, just this once, we'd get a break from Karen. I should have known better, because just as I was starting to relax, I heard it. That unmistakable, grating voice cutting sharply through the hum of friendly conversation. I tensed, my jaw clenching slightly as I turned toward the source of the disruption. And there she was, Karen. She was standing near one of the food stalls, already deep in one of her signature complaints, her arms flailing in exaggerated frustration as she berated some poor volunteer over what I could only assume was some trivial inconvenience. Nathan stiffened beside me. I didn't need to ask. I already knew he had seen her too. At first, Karen didn't notice us. She was too busy demanding whatever unreasonable thing she had set her sights on this time. But then, as if she had some sixth sense for finding ways to ruin a peaceful moment, she turned. Her gaze swept over the festival grounds, passing over booths, groups of neighbors and families, until it landed on Nathan. And just like that, her entire demeanor shifted. The forced cheerfulness drained from her expression so quickly it was like someone had flipped a switch. I felt Nathan tense beside me, his fingers gripping the hem of my shirt. His entire mood had changed in an instant, and I knew why, because he saw it too. The moment Karen's face twisted in irritation, the way her lips pursed disapprovingly, how her shoulders stiffened as if our very presence had ruined her day. Nathan swallowed hard. Dad, can we go? I turned to him, my stomach tightening. He looked uncomfortable, tense, already exhausted by the weight of this unspoken hostility. I hated it. I hated that a child, my child, felt like he had to leave a public event because of one miserable person. I took a slow breath, forcing a reassuring smile. Let's just take a walk around first, all right? We don't have to stay long. He hesitated but nodded, his posture still rigid. I wasn't going to let her ruin this for him. But deep down, I had a sinking feeling. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. We took a slow walk around the festival grounds, and I could feel Nathan start to relax. The further we got from Karen, the more he eased up, his posture looser, his smile more natural. For the first time since we arrived, he seemed to be enjoying himself. There was so much to see. Colorful booths lined the walkways, kids ran past us laughing, and the scent of roasted corn and funnel cakes filled the air. Whenever I spotted something that made his eyes light up, a toy, a treat, a game, I didn't hesitate to buy it for him. It was worth every penny to see him smile. After a while, Nathan even joined some of the other kids in a game. I stood nearby, watching as he interacted with them, his laughter mixing with theirs. He was having fun. Finally, and for the first time that day, I let my guard down. I figured it wouldn't hurt to step away for a moment, just to watch a game being played at a nearby stall by some of the other parents. Nathan was safe, surrounded by people, enjoying himself. I kept him within eyesight as I moved a few feet away, my attention shifting between the game and his laughter in the background. But then I saw her, Karen. She had moved closer to where Nathan was playing, now seated on a bench a few feet away. Her phone was in her hand, a video call open, her laughter light and casual as she spoke to someone on the other end. But then, she noticed Nathan, and everything about her changed. At first, it was subtle. Her face tensed, her jaw clenched. But then, she let out an exaggerated huff, rolling her eyes so dramatically it was impossible to ignore. She leaned into her phone, whispering something, shaking her head like Nathan's very presence offended her. That was all I needed to see. I immediately started moving. I pushed through the crowd, heart pounding. I knew Karen. I knew how easily she could turn a minor annoyance into something cruel. But I wasn't fast enough, because before I could reach them, Karen shot up from the bench, her phone still clutched in one hand. Then, she stormed toward Nathan. I moved faster, dodging between groups of people, my pulse hammering. And then she started yelling. People turned their heads, caught off guard by the sudden outburst. Some parents instinctively pulled their kids closer, whispering among themselves. And just as I broke through the crowd, I lost sight of them for half a second. But that was all it took. When I finally caught up, Karen was no longer next to Nathan. She stood alone on the hill near the riverside. And Nathan was gone. A second later, panic screams erupted from the crowd. I didn't stop to ask. I didn't hesitate. I ran. By the time I reached the water's edge, I already knew what had happened. My son was in the water. Karen had pushed him, wheelchair and all, into the river. And every instinct I had as a soldier, as a father, as a human being, kicked in at once. My body moved before my mind could catch up. The river wasn't fast-moving, but the current had already pulled Nathan away from the shore, carrying him further out before I could reach him. I lunged into the water, pushing forward with everything I had. The icy shock of it barely registered. I wasn't thinking about the cold. I wasn't thinking about the crowd behind me. All I could see was my son, drifting further and further away. My heart slammed against my ribs as I swam toward him, my arms cutting through the water with frantic, powerful strokes. Nathan was struggling, his small hands reaching out, his face pale with shock. If he had still been trapped in the wheelchair, he wouldn't have had a chance. The weight of it would have dragged him straight to the bottom. But somehow, by pure survival instinct, he had managed to free himself from the chair in the initial fall. I reached him just as his strength was giving out. His movements were slowing, his body trembling violently from the cold. "I got you, buddy. I got you." With one strong pull, I wrapped an arm around him and started kicking back toward the shore. My muscles burned, the weight of his body making every motion heavier, but I didn't stop, not for a second. By the time I dragged us both to the riverbank, a few bystanders had rushed forward, pulling us the rest of the way onto dry land. Nathan was shaking, his face nearly as pale as the clouds above. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. Shock. I barely registered the voices around me, the concerned murmurs, the hands reaching out to help. All that mattered was Nathan. I wrapped my arms around him, pressing him against my chest, trying to transfer whatever warmth I had left. "You're okay. You're okay," I whispered, more for myself than him. And then I saw her, Karen, standing just a few feet away, her phone held up, recording, grinning. For a split second, I thought I was imagining it, that my mind was playing tricks on me, that there was no way anyone could be that heartless. But no, she was smirking, smiling like she had just won some petty, twisted game. I could hear the faint audio of her phone playing back the recording. She had filmed everything, and she was pleased with herself. Nathan had ruined her video, so instead, she made one of us. A slow, seething rage burned through my chest. This wasn't just cruelty. This was evil. And for the first time in my life, I felt something I never had before. The kind of anger that makes a man want to destroy something. Karen had no idea who she was messing with, but she was about to find out. Once I was certain Nathan was breathing steadily, his trembling easing just enough, I gently passed him into the care of one of the festival volunteers. They wrapped a blanket around him, murmuring reassurances, but I could barely hear any of it, because my focus was locked on Karen. My body moved before my brain could even process it. I stormed across the grass, my boots hitting the ground with force, every muscle in my body coiled tight with pure, undiluted rage. Karen saw me coming. She didn't flinch. Instead, she lifted her phone higher, holding it out between us like a flimsy shield, as if a screen would protect her from the firestorm she had just unleashed. "Whoa, whoa, easy there, big guy," she said with an infuriating smirk, like she thought this was some kind of game. I stopped just short of grabbing that phone and throwing it into the river where my son had just nearly drowned. "What the hell is wrong with you?" My voice came out low, controlled, too controlled. Karen, still shamelessly recording, gave an exaggerated shrug. "Look, it's not my fault your kid can't handle himself," she scoffed. "You know, I really don't think it's appropriate for someone like him to be out here. I just mean, this festival has a lot of activity. It's probably too much for," she gestured toward Nathan. "Kids like him, that chair of his, rolled right off the hill on its own. Maybe if you actually watched him instead of playing hero, this wouldn't have happened." I could have sworn the air around us went dead silent. Even the distant sounds of festival goers faded into the background. Because she didn't stop there. Karen let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Honestly, this whole thing is kind of funny," she muttered, shaking her head. "One minute he's up, the next, splash. Bet you weren't expecting that kind of entertainment at a family festival." Then, as if she had just remembered I was still standing there, her face darkened. She narrowed her eyes and sneered. "And yet, you just had to go and ruin the moment by pulling that piece of trash out of the water." Something inside me snapped. I stepped forward, my presence looming over her, my voice no longer controlled. I went full drill sergeant mode. "You listen to me, and you listen good," I roared, my voice booming so loudly it echoed. "That piece of trash is my son, and if I ever catch you so much as looking in his direction again, I swear on everything you hold dear, you will regret it." Karen's smirk vanished. Her face drained of all color, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to speak, but couldn't form a single word. I didn't stop. "You think this is funny?" I barked, stepping closer, forcing her to step back. "You think nearly drowning a child is some kind of joke?" Karen stumbled, her confidence cracking. The phone in her hand wobbled, her grip no longer steady. "You might think you run this neighborhood," I continued, my tone dropping into a cold, deadly quiet. "But let me be perfectly clear. You do not scare me. And after what you just did, you're done here." For the first time since I met her, Karen looked genuinely afraid. She didn't have a comeback. She didn't even try. She just stood there, frozen, as the weight of her actions finally caught up to her. Satisfied, I turned on my heel and strode back to my son, because he was the only thing that mattered. And Karen? She would be answering for what she did. As I turned back to Nathan, the weight of dozens of eyes pressed down on me. The once lively festival had fallen into a tense silence, replaced by hushed whispers and cautious glances. People were watching, recording, judging. I could feel it, the invisible line being drawn. Some were staring at me like I was the problem, like I was the out-of-control man who had just yelled at one of their own. A woman near the food stalls shook her head, clutching her purse like she had just witnessed a dangerous criminal in action. "I always knew he was trouble," she whispered to the man beside her. "Men like that don't belong in neighborhoods like ours." Her friend nodded, crossing his arms. "Yelling like a lunatic. What a disgrace." Another man, one I had never seen before, narrowed his eyes at me like I was an animal that had slipped the leash. His phone was still held up, recording. "This is gonna go viral," he muttered under his breath, smirking. They didn't care about the truth. And Karen? She played her role flawlessly. She hunched her shoulders, her lower lip trembling like she had been the one thrown into the water. This is exactly what I was afraid of," she sniffled, casting a nervous glance toward part of the crowd that sided with her. "I was only trying to keep the peace. Others weren't so quick to take Karen's side. Not everyone was fooled." "Are you serious?" A young woman near the game booths folded her arms, glaring at Karen. "We all saw what happened. You pushed that kid. And now you're acting like you're the victim." A few people murmured in agreement. An older man, one of the neighbors who had welcomed me when I first moved in, looked disgusted. He turned to his wife, shaking his head. "She's been targeting that family since the day they got here," he muttered. "Now look what she's done." A few festival-goers hesitated, torn. They had known Karen for years. She was on the HOA, attended neighborhood events, played the role of a respectable community leader. But now they were seeing a different side of her. Nathan needed me, so as I made my way back to him, I became aware of more phones, cameras. People watching, recording, treating this like a live news event. And suddenly, it was too much for me, adding fuel to the fire already burning in my chest. And then a flash of anger. "Step back," I snapped, my voice cutting through the air like a whip. The reaction was immediate. Some people flinched. A few took hurried steps away. I hadn't meant for it to come out so sharp, so commanding, but right now I didn't care. Nathan needed space. I needed space. The crowd hesitated, unsure, so I doubled down. "This is not a show," I said, my voice lower but no less firm. "If you're not here to help, then move." That seemed to work. The bystanders slowly shifted back, some muttering under their breath, others lowering their phones. A few neighbors, the ones with actual concern on their faces, remained close but gave us room. "I already called 911, a woman said, stepping forward. She was older, maybe in her late 50s, with sharp eyes and a firm stance. She had the presence of someone who had seen enough of the world to know when something was dead wrong. Her words snapped me back to reality. Emergency services were on their way. Help was coming. I took a steadying breath, trying to force down the rage still coiling in my gut. Right now, I needed to focus on what really mattered. Nathan. I turned back toward my son, crouching beside him as he shivered beneath the blanket. His breathing was still unsteady. His small fingers curled tightly into the fabric. "Dad?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to stay calm for him. "I'm right here, buddy," I said, my voice softer now. "I've got you." From the corner of my eye, I saw Karen still standing there, her phone still raised, her face a mix of shock and defiance. The police arrived not long after, lights flashing, radios crackling as they stepped out of their cruisers. Everything after that felt like a blur of chaos and tension. Nathan was still shaking, barely able to hold onto the blanket wrapped around him, and I wasn't about to leave his side. When the paramedics arrived, they insisted he be taken to the hospital for immediate medical evaluation. I barely had the chance to speak to the officers before I was climbing into the ambulance beside him, holding his hand the entire ride. I should have felt relief. Nathan was alive, and for now he was safe. But I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. By the time I arrived at the precinct later that evening, I knew I had to control my emotions. This wasn't a battlefield, but the stakes were just as high. If I lost here, I lost everything. Karen was already settled in, wrapped in a blanket like she had survived some horrible ordeal. Her expression was carefully crafted, a mix of fragile distress and righteous anger. A woman wronged, a victim. I clenched my jaw, inhaling slowly. This was a trap. And if I handled this like a fight, throwing punches, even verbal ones, I'd lose. Instead, I did what I had trained my men to do in high-pressure situations. Assess the field. Identify weaknesses. Control the narrative before the enemy does. I scanned the officers at the desk, picking up details immediately. The lead officer interrogating me. Mid-40s, no nonsense, but his eyes weren't completely hostile. He wasn't convinced yet, but he was willing to listen. A younger officer was taking notes, early 30s, arms crossed, standing slightly closer to Karen. Not a good sign. Then the desk sergeant behind them, watching the whole exchange like he already knew Karen's type. Possible ally. Karen had jumped ahead, shaping the story before I even got here. If I didn't act fast, they'd only see her version. Step 2, I let Karen talk first. I didn't interrupt her. I knew the worst thing I could do right now was look defensive or aggressive. So I let her ramble. She sobbed, fake but effective. complained about me being unstable, aggressive, and dangerous. She made sure to phrase things carefully, never outright accusing me of attacking her, but insinuating that I had lost control. The young officer took more notes. Not good. When it was time for me, I was ready to counter the lies. I sat forward, keeping my body language controlled. No fists, no anger, just confidence. Officer, let's go through the facts. I turned to the lead cop, forcing eye contact. My son was pushed into a river today. You have witnesses for that. You have footage. The room shifted slightly. The paramedics took him straight to the hospital. That's on record too. You can verify. I could feel Karen stiffen beside me. She knew where this was going. Now let's talk about Karen. She's had run-ins with my family before, harassing us about our home modifications, making complaints. Again, documented. I'm happy to provide texts, emails, and reports from other neighbors. The desk sergeant raised an eyebrow. He wasn't siding with me yet, but I could tell he was starting to think. Karen scoffed, her mask slipping just a little. He's twisting everything. I was just trying to de-escalate the situation. I let the words hang for a second. Then I went in for the kill. You were de-escalating by filming a drowning child? I asked, my voice steady. Karen flinched. The lead officer's jaw tightened. Bingo. I knew it was now time to turn the narrative against her. I leaned back, now fully in control. So let's be clear. You want to talk about me losing my temper? I shook my head. I'm a drill sergeant. I've trained men under worse pressure than this. But Karen? She pushed a disabled child into the water. That's attempted murder or, at the very least, reckless endangerment. And instead of helping, she recorded it like entertainment. That did it. The energy in the room shifted. The younger officer stopped writing. The desk sergeant nodded slightly. The lead cop's expression hardened. And Karen? She knew she had lost control. Her face flushed red, and she snapped, "That's not what happened." But now, she was the one on the defensive. I exhaled slowly, keeping my voice calm and measured. "Check the footage, officer. I'll wait." And with that, I sealed her fate. The tension in the interrogation room was suffocating. Karen had spun her web of lies flawlessly, using every ounce of her manipulative charm to paint herself as the helpless victim. She played the trembling, well-respected community leader, while I was the unstable, aggressive man with a temper. But I had seen this kind of psychological warfare before, and I knew exactly how to dismantle it. I had kept my cool, laid out the facts, and slowly shifted the momentum back in my favor. Then, the lead officer, the one who had been silent, listening carefully, finally spoke. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together, his gaze locking onto Karen like a predator zeroing in on its prey. "Ms. Karen," he said, his tone even but laced with finality. "This isn't looking good for you." Karen's breath hitched. For the first time, she looked nervous. I could almost see the gears turning in her head, the realization sinking in. She had assumed she was untouchable, that her reputation, her connections, and her manipulations would shield her. But now, she was losing control. The younger officer, the one who had initially seemed to side with her, stiffened, shifting uncomfortably. Even he could see it now. I watched as the lead officer flipped through the case file one last time, then exhaled sharply. "We've got multiple witness statements contradicting your story. The footage we reviewed doesn't support your version of events. And, most damning of all," he slid a printed image across the table. "You were caught recording instead of helping." Karen's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, to deny, to plead, to spin. But the evidence was right in front of her. And for the first time since this nightmare started, she had no way out. A slow, tense silence filled the room. Then the officer turned to me. His expression shifted, still professional, but with a hint of something else. "Respect. You'll want to stay close to your son for the time being," he said, nodding. "We'll handle things from here." That was it. That was the moment I knew we had won. Karen wasn't walking away from this. It took hours of statements, evidence reviews, and back-and-forth discussions. But in the end, the truth finally won. Karen was officially charged with attempted murder. When the final decision came down, I expected her to explode, to scream, to protest, to double down on her lies. But instead, she just sat there, frozen. For the first time, her fake confidence had completely shattered. The realization hit her like a freight train. There was no talking her way out of this. No HOA board to manipulate. No passive-aggressive letters to send. No neighbors to intimidate. Just cold, hard justice. And the best part? All charges against me were dropped on the spot. I was free to go. I stood up, rolling my shoulders as the weight of the last few days finally began to lift. But before I walked out of that station for good, I spared one last glance at Karen. She was still sitting there, staring blankly ahead, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Couldn't help but smirk. "Hey, Karen," I said, keeping my voice low and calm. She blinked, slowly turning her head toward me. I tilted mine slightly, feigning curiosity. "You always loved controlling the neighborhood, Karen. I wonder how you're gonna handle prison. Considering you don't get to choose your neighbors. Good luck with that." Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. There were no more fake tears, no more excuses, no more smug arrogance, just silence. And with that, I walked out, stepping into the crisp night air, knowing that for the first time since moving into that neighborhood, Karen was finally gone, and my son was finally safe. If you believe in standing up for what's right, and want to continue to see more stories like this, make sure you like and subscribe to our channel Tales Oak. Every day we share captivating Karen HOA stories you won't want to miss. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.